So greetings, everyone, and welcome to Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar, and I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center, and Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very happy today to have Professor Alegi as our guest speaker, and before I pass it over to him, a brief introduction. Tita Alegi is Professor of History at Michigan State University and the author of several books, including Laduma, Soccer, Politics and Society in South Africa, and African Soccer Spaces, How a Continent Changed the World Game. Currently, he's writing a book titled Afripod, How Scholarly Podcasting is Changing African Studies. Professor Alegi teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on the history of South Africa, modern Africa, and global soccer. He has received many teaching awards at MSU, including the Fintz Award for Teaching Excellence in the Arts and Humanities. Professor Alegi hosts the Africa Past and Present podcast and convenes the Football Scholars Forum, an online book club with more than 200 members. He is book series editor for Michigan State University's African History and Culture series, and served on the boards of the International Journal of African Historical Studies, African Studies, and Sports Africa. Thank you so much, Professor Alegi, for being here. We look forward to the talk.
Thanks, Awa, and thanks everyone for coming here on this gray, rainy day, and thank you for joining us online, wherever you may be. With more than 5 million podcasts available today on Spotify, it is no wonder that the Africa Podfest report from 2022 stated that podcasting has become an integral part of the digital media landscape, both globally and in Africa. And what I'm going to talk about today draws on a larger book project in progress. And I'm going to basically present an ongoing work, so it's very provisional. I look forward to the Q&A. I try to bring to life people's soundscapes, personal memories of the world of sound, acoustic ecologies in their lives. And then I turn to the historical relationship between sonic technology and the power of listeners, or listener agency, as historians like to say, and explore how these shifting dynamics influenced podcasting's current boom. In the final part of the presentation, I'm going to dig into the specifics of technical craftsmanship, intellectual labor, and importantly, the teamwork required to produce a show aimed at scholars and broad audiences alike. The evidence I'm going to use to make this case comes mainly from approximately 50 hours of interviews that I've conducted in the past couple of years with technicians, some of them in this room, podcasters, and listeners, also some of them in this room, as well as about 15 years of experience hosting the Africa Past and Present podcast with my colleague and friend, Peter Lim, now retired, former Africana bibliographer, and of course, adjunct professor of history at MSU. My argument is that podcasting's popularity can be explained in part by its capacity to generate a powerful sense of intimacy. So the question is, where does this power come from? Soundscapes mark the human experience. As David Hendy put it in his book, Noise, A Human History of Sound and Listening, the sounds we humans have made through history, the most disconcerting and ugly of sounds, as well as the most pleasurable, have always been laden in meaning. They gave our ancestors, just as they give us still, a sense of place and time, a sense of danger and comfort, a sense of connection with other people. They have helped make us human. Podcasting's use of what Siobhan McHugh in her recent book, The Power of Podcasting, calls the seductive power of sound relies on multiple factors. According to Frances Dyson in her book, Sounding New Media, quote, sound surrounds. Its phenomenal characteristics, the fact that it is invisible, intangible, ephemeral, and vibrational, coordinate with the physiology of the ears to create a perceptual experience profoundly different from the dominant sense of sight. Immersed in sound, the subject loses itself, and in many ways loses its sense, because hearing is not a discrete sense. To hear is also to be touched, both physically and emotionally. We feel low sound vibrate in our stomachs and start to panic. Sharp, sudden sound makes us flinch involuntarily. A high-pitched scream is emotionally wrenching. Sound has immediate and obvious physical effects. In listening, one is engaged in a synergy with the world and the senses, a hearing/touch that is the essence of what we mean by gut reaction, a response that is simultaneously physiological and psychological, body and mind. So we might borrow from Marx and say that people make their own sound history, but not in circumstances of their own choice. And this comes out in part one of this three-part presentation: orality and biography. What I mean by orality, and thank you to Matrix and the Archive of Malian Photography for providing some of these illustrations. I encourage all the people here, if you haven't already, and all the viewers/listeners out there to visit this amazing open access digital archive, the Archive of Malian Photography, because it is just a gold mine of art and creativity and representation. What I mean by orality is a combination of orality, that is the spoken word and sound making, plus hearing and listening. Similar to what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan author, calls orature in his famous book, Decolonizing the Mind. And here I'm drawing on the work of Reginald Royston, among others, to borrow this concept and build on the concept of orality. The composer and author, R. Murray Schafer's canonical works in sound studies emphasized how our listening practices and habits allowed and continue to allow us to interpret our sonic environment. In fact, most of the people that I spoke with for this project volunteered vivid memories of growing up with the everyday sounds of news bulletins, sports broadcasts, talk shows, and a plethora of different sound genres. And these recollections demonstrate, I think, how sound marks, punctuates people's personal lives, and suggests how the shifting soundscapes of childhood, of adolescence, and adulthood laid the foundations for individuals' positive reception, even disposition towards listening to podcasts later in life. Radio looms large. James Babatunde Yegu from the University of Kansas told me, growing up in Lagos, I would wake up every 5 a.m. to the call of prayer of these muezzins on my street. And then I have to get up because my dad would be ready to go pray. I also loved listening to the radio as a kid. My interest in soccer actually started by listening to the radio. I've always wanted to explore the world of language. I think listening to soccer commentaries on the radio was one of the things that animated that desire. The Tanzanian scholar, Chambi Chachage, currently at Carleton College, recalled how growing up in Dar es Salaam, the media was not liberalized. It was really under the state, the ruling party. The only thing that we relied on as far as media is concerned was newspapers and radio. So I grew up in that tradition. As a kid, most of the things that mattered were sports news. I'm not sure how we can get rid of this. Growing up in South Africa, about 100 kilometers or so outside of Johannesburg, Charles Leonard, a South African journalist, audio producer, and podcaster. If you haven't listened to his wonderful series, This is Joburg, please do, told me that when he was young in South Africa, there was a radio station called LM Radio, short for Lorenzo Marx Radio, Maputo, broadcasting from Mozambique. Its main audience was Johannesburg. It was a pop music station. It was on shortwave, and to me, that was a little bit of a rebel radio, he said, because it opened my ears to the music that was out there. This is important in a heavily censored media environment like that of apartheid South Africa. The Beatles, James Brown, Led Zepp, that was my soundscape, and it made me want to be like those guys. So at the intersection of soundscape, memory, and culture, everyday African orality resonates with people's experiences in other parts of the world. I have several examples, but I'm just going to give you a couple from my interviews to illustrate this point. I mentioned Siobhan McHugh earlier, author, documentary maker, award-winning podcast producer, and the author of The Power of Podcasting. She told me, I come from Ireland, and we have a long ingrained tradition of oral storytelling. Even though I was born in Dublin and grew up in an urban environment, the voice was always very much key. You had gatherings in the living room. It might be somebody's birthday. It might just be a family gathering. You had to do something, so you always had something at the ready, a story or poem or song. You sing a cappella without any instruments. Even in the pubs, when people were drunk, they would just shut up out of respect for that singer. That's in our DNA. And that, I suppose, has informed my academic direction. Growing up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Marisol Fila, PhD student in Latin American Studies at the University of Michigan, told me, quote, I definitely grew up listening to radio. I remember when I was in elementary school, every morning when I was having breakfast, my mom was turning on the radio to listen to the news, and I can still remember it. The intro music from that morning news program, it was called Magdalena Tempranismo. I don't remember watching TV in the morning, but we were always listening to the radio. And finally, our colleague, Julian Chambliss in the English department at MSU and podcaster, said, I grew up with radio. Of course, in the African-American community, radio has a prominent place, both in terms of popular leisure culture, but also in terms of political culture. I grew up in the 80s listening to and hearing the transformation associated with hip hop and urban rap. In my personal experience, I listened to a lot of radio in college. I worked at a radio station. I was both on air and production person at my college radio station. At one point, hosting my own show, indeed throughout my entire undergraduate career. And so I do think of podcasting from a radio perspective, and with a sense of the continuing importance of radio audio as accessible media for a lot of marginalized communities. Part two builds on this important argument, I think, about the connection between soundscapes and the disposition towards podcast production and consumption. Because orality has been, and I think continues to be, inextricably linked to technological change. Obviously, in the time that we have available here today, I'm not able to give you a full history of sound technologies. It's beyond the scope of this talk. But it is important to note that personal sonic consumption of the type that we are familiar with podcasting is hardly a new development. One could argue that it originated with Thomas Edison's invention of the phonograph in 1877, a device that established itself by the interwar period as a highly sought-after listening device in many middle-class homes, including, by the way, in colonial Africa. This is when HMV, for example, starts putting out records with African artists with increasing frequency. So in 1931, Discs Magazine, which you can find on the Internet Archive, that wonderful open access resource I hope everyone contributes to, extolled the virtues of private listening to recorded discs. Quote, alone with the phonograph, all the unpleasant externals are removed. The interpreter had been disposed of. The audience has been disposed of. The uncomfortable concert hall has been disposed of. You are alone with the composer and his music. Surely no more ideal circumstances could be imagined. Fast forward to the 1950s, the explosion in popularity of LP albums, and then in the 60s of portable and fairly affordable transistor radios, propelled the creation of a mass culture and a market for sound production and consumption. As car stereos and cassette players of improved quality became the norm in many countries in the 70s and 80s, on-demand mobile music listening became more common. A representative comment about experiencing these changes came from the historian of Angola, Marissa Moorman, currently at the University of Wisconsin. She said, "My father had an 8-track tape player in the car." Again, think about mobility and listening here. "I remember being small enough," she said, "that the 8-track tapes seemed really big. And it took 2 hands to put them into the player. We had the Jackson 5 and Joni Mitchell's Blue and whatever. And so for me, sound and radio in particular, as any good American, are deeply associated with car culture." Nothing incentivized individualized forms of mobile listening into everyday life more than the Walkman, the personal cassette player launched in 1979 by Sony. According to Rebecca Toulouse-Dubrow, the Walkman, arguably the first mass personal device, introduced possibilities that we now take for granted, but that were largely unprecedented at the time. It gave people the power to enhance their experiences while tuning out their surroundings. It fueled the idea that we can and should always have access to our personal choice of entertainment. Again, think playlists here, think podcasts. It facilitated, she continued, what we now call multitasking, which is how many people listen to podcasts, by the way, with all the efficiencies and distractions that the term implies. And it entrenched the notion of electronic gadgets as accessories. Andreas Pavel, a Brazilian-German inventor, quite an eclectic guy, who had patented a prototype of an Walkman in the early 1970s and eventually got wrapped up in a fierce and long lawsuit with Sony that was eventually resolved in the 90s, explained the Walkman's attraction. What was the allure, he said? The sudden portability of gorgeous, head-filling sound. The Walkman unmoored you. Now you could walk down the street and the music altered the very experience of looking at the world. Life became a film. It emotionalized your life. It actually put magic into your life. Of course, millions of Walkmans were sold globally, and by 1982, the sale of cassette tapes in the US surpassed that of LP records, and cassettes quickly took over street markets all over Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Speaking to the historian Amira Rose Davis, who also co-hosted for many years the Burn It All Down sports feminist podcast, I got a very tangible personal experience of how listener agency served as a bridge between old and new technologies, but also how it increasingly transformed listeners into content managers and creators. Quote, "When I was in middle school, the radio is where we would get a bunch of songs. I was one of the kids who had cassette tapes, and I would try to record to make my own mixtapes. That's how we managed the technology at the time, as you're waiting for your favorite song to come on the radio and then press record so you can have your own curation, if you will. I'm a millennial. I now have this new ability to create my own stuff without the radio." In 1982, Sony introduced the compact disc for the market, and 4 years later, the sale of CDs surpassed that of cassettes. Here we have the beginning of digital audio beginning to replace analog formats. With the rise of the public internet in the 90s, Netscape Navigator became synonymous with the World Wide Web, and Napster famously popularized peer-to-peer sharing, file sharing by the late 1990s. The important thing about these technologies for our purposes today is that they expanded horizons of usage and possibilities of audio for both ordinary, sort of non-geek listeners and audiophiles alike. And with the expansion of the commercial internet, listeners developed an openness to engaging with multiple forms of audio. And for this project, I'm in the process of building a detailed chronology of podcasting. So here you're seeing part of it, beginning in 1992 in Silicon Valley with the first audiocast by the Internet Engineering Task Force, the first live stream from the National Press Club in December of 1993, the rise of MP3 and real audio formats and the kind of rise of proto-podcasting in 95. And then finally, we get to a historic day, the day of George W. Bush's presidential inauguration. That was also the day that Dave Weiner published the first podcast, January 20th, 2001. He demonstrated the RSS enclosure. RSS stands for really simple syndication. The enclosure feature by enclosing a song in his quite popular scripting blog. A high-fidelity Grateful Dead song every day, wrote Dave Weiner. This is where we're experimenting with enclosures on RSS news items that download when you're not using your computer. If it works, and in parentheses he added, it will be the end of click and wait multimedia experience on the internet, end quote. Timing is everything. By November, we have a new toy on the market, the iPod. And by early 2004, the term podcasting was popularized. A neologism that combined the name of the iPod, Apple's hugely successful kind of 21st century Walkman, if you will, with the more traditional broadcasting. Many credit Ben Hammersley in The Guardian with coining the term podcasting. I'm not sure that's true, but certainly helped him popularize it. And he said in the article, with the benefit of hindsight, it all seems quite obvious. MP3 players like Apple's iPod in many pockets, audio production software cheap or free, and weblogging, an established part of the internet. All the ingredients are there for a new boom in amateur radio, he called it. But what do we call it? Audio blogging? Podcasting? Guerrilla media? Apple asserted itself very quickly as the dominant player in the first decade of podcasting. You could see this by their introduction of Apple iTunes as the first place where RSS feeds were aggregated into a directory. This happened in 2005, thus providing crucial support for podcasts and establishing Apple users, in fact, as the main consumers of podcasts. As the audio scholar Richard Berry aptly put it, quote, only when Apple embraced podcasts in 2005 and added the capacity to download podcasts via iTunes did the process finally become more fluid and one that the average user could navigate, end quote. The numbers bear this out. User interest in podcasting rose quickly. One blogger, for example, found 24 search results for podcasts in September of 2004. Nearly 57 million exactly a year later. Indeed, the new Oxford American Dictionary in 2005 declared podcast the word of the year. And Apple's dominance grew as a result of the release of the iPhone, which put a computer in our pockets, expanded further the following year with the release of the iPhone 3G, with, there was an Android equivalent, the G1, and the number of people who listen to podcasts shot up considerably. It seemed that everyone from technology folks to random comedians had started publishing. In 2012, Apple recognized this phenomenon and put out the Apple Podcasts app, which a couple of years later became native in iOS. Apple maintained this dominance until about 2021 when Spotify overtook it. And if you look at the African context, right, mobile phones play a huge role, massive role in internet access. Again, drawing on the Africa Podfest report of 2022, these infographics point out that nearly 90% of the users surveyed in Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria access the internet through their mobile phones, right? Less than 11% through their desktops. even fewer, a tiny number through tablets or iPads. What's also interesting about the survey, and again, it's available online. I highly encourage you to dig into the kind of demographics of podcasting on the continent and how they're changing by reading it. It's interesting that those who listen to podcasts are committed to the medium, right? They listen to it on a weekly basis, and many of them listen to a podcast several times a week. This brings us to the scholarly podcast section of the talk, part 3, with a nice double entendre. Sound scholarship matters. What do I mean by that? Well, hopefully it'll become clear as we go along. There are basically 2 main genres of scholarly podcasting out there. They both tend to be non-scripted talk shows. One is the Chatcast, aimed at a broad audience, and the other one is the one that you might be familiar with if you listen to Africa Past and Present, the interview show with scholars, mainly aimed at scholars. And the media studies scholar Andrew Bottomley has written a great book called Sound Streams, A Cultural History of Radio-Internet Convergence, in which he points out that this makes sense, that the non-scripted talk show would be the leading form of scholarly podcasting, not just because we like to listen to our own voice all the time, but, quote, podcasting in its earliest stages developed an unscripted style of talk centered around personal experience and self-expression, writes Bottomley. This informal, self-reflexive, often mundane conversational style, which was actually a convergence of not only radio and the internet, but also blog/diary writing and the telephone, carried over into many areas of modern podcasting, and even made an indelible mark on the social media discourse that today pervades platforms like Twitter, now X, which itself, writes Bottomley, started as an audio blogging service, end quote. Chatcasts are an important part of the podcast ecosystem. One of my favorite ones is The Black Athlete, Past to Present, hosted by 2 historians, Lewis Moore at Grand Valley State University and Derek White at the University of Kentucky. When I spoke with Lou, he said this to me about the Chatcast. Quote, it's a way for us to put ourselves out there as experts, but also have conversations that we normally have on the phone. We're credible enough, we're good enough at what we do that as something's happened in the sports world, we just sit down and we can talk about it for 30 minutes and boom, the next day, it's up online. Just last week, I spoke with Derek White, and he said, we feel really good about our little niche in podcasting that we have in the world of podcasting as professional historians, as scholars, and as sports fans. That ability to blend the scholarly background with the deep kind of sports knowledge is something that no one else can get. It's no wonder that when there is a big story in sports and politics that requires an informed historical perspective, you will often find scholars like Lou Moore now on ESPN, for instance, as well as Derek White and others. But chatcasts are only part of the story. Perhaps more important and influential in scholarly circles are the interview style shows. And ours was one of the first, started in 2008, just less than a year after the introduction of the iPhone. But others that have been going strong are the China and Africa podcast since, I believe, 2010, Ufahamu Africa, the Hip Hop African, and the most recent entry, the Africanist. Scholarly podcasts rely on effective teamwork. The skillful labor of recording engineers and sound editors are important in creating that intimacy of sound. In our experience with Africa Past and Present, cooperation between us, the hosts, and sound technicians, like Mike Green, has been essential. A quiet recording space and higher-end external mics are basic necessities, and increasingly affordable, by the way. In an increasingly crowded podcast ecosystem with millions of shows, a high-quality recording enhances the likelihood of gaining and retaining an audience. Few listeners will lend their ears to, as one interviewee put it to me, some bloke who no doubt has got enormous expertise, but was just mumbling into a pillow or something, end quote. Or even more bluntly, as another interviewee put it, quote, no one's ever recommended me a podcast that doesn't sound good, end quote. So where does this good sound come from? And again, the technical craftsmanship is vital. Scott Pennington was our first sound editor and producer, and he said this to me about recording the first shows. Frankly, I wasn't paying attention to what you all were saying. I was watching the levels, watching the recorder, making sure you're staying in the levels and making sure everybody sounded good, you know, because I had a vested interest in that. If you all sounded good on the original take, when we get the show done, it made editing a lot easier. I didn't have to take out noise and all the things you do in post-production. But he also added something interesting. Quote, I think there's a value to that original, meaning conversation, the authentic conversation between a couple of scholars, and I didn't want to interrupt that, end quote. Annette Molendick, who was an undergraduate at the Matrix Digital Lab, which has been a vital partner in Africa past and present history and a key to its sustainability. She was our recordist and sound editor and now works as a media producer. She said, quote, it was very easy to create a conversation that was fluid because it started off so fluid and it was very natural. You guys had your nice intro setup that works perfectly. The music really puts you in the right headspace to listen. So I think that really made it easy, and communicating with you about what we really wanted to focus on too, because we could cut out parts of the conversation if guests didn't focus on what it was that we were trying to say in the moment, which has helped me in my career when I do more documentary style work. The capacity building of this exercise is something I talk about in a different chapter of the book manuscript, by the way. Another undergraduate sound technician who has now gone on to be a music teacher and band leader in Colorado, I believe, Andrew Zakursky, was very important in setting up a new studio for Africa Past and Present. He was also our sound editor for some time. And he said, you know, I did more of the editing on the back end. What I brought to that side of it is that with my musical ear and sensibility, I think it helped me have a good ear for the natural cadence of voice and speaking. I think the biggest thing that stands out to me was helping to get that new studio up and running in 2018, because I think listening back to older episodes of the podcast, I listened to the ones in the new studio, and I think the ones in that studio just sound awesome. Maybe I'm biased, just maybe, because I helped to build it, but I think it has a really great sound. I think he's right. And I'll end with Mike Green, who has been recorded sound editor, producer, factotum of the Africa Past and Present podcast for at least a decade. He points out, you know, that teamwork is important, not just between the host and the technicians, but among the technicians themselves. Quote, having Emmanuel, Andrew, Alan, Annette, Justin, Patrick working on this, man, I hope I got everybody. They really had an ear for those things. We talked about creative editors and technical editors. Somebody could take charge of doing the editing on a machine and cut things, while somebody else could be like, well, what if we pan the voiceover here a little more? What if we had the music come in here? Having that ability to make some small adjustments or to try to tweak something, once you do it, it's pretty fun and it becomes like an art. The fly on the wall feeling that I think is part of the Africa Past and Present brand and podcasts like it. What really makes interviews with scholars interesting, even pleasurable, is not a simple thing to create, and it's not an inevitable outcome. As David Goldblatt, the award-winning author, journalist, and radio documentarian, who's done some excellent pieces, by the way, on African sport, wrestling in Senegal, football in Ugandan prisons, rivalries between Accra Hearts of Oak and Asante Kotoko in Ghana, and so on and so forth. He said to me, quote, the truth is being consistently interesting, if not entertaining, and listenable is quite hard. Everybody thinks you just sit down and talk. It's like most people are actually effing boring to listen to. They think they're kind of smart and sassy, and I don't know, it's just not working for me. But it's a good format. I wish there were more sort of smart people with high standards doing it. And occasionally, you find a gem. One of these gems is the Phantom Power podcast. If you haven't listened to it, treat yourself. Rigorous preparation and planning for each episode, of course, is required, but as Mac Hagood, the host of Phantom Power and a professor of media studies at Miami University of Ohio, notes, the interviewing style matters. Quote, people talk about the intimacy of podcasting. It's not just that there's a voice in your ears, it's that there's an enactment of dialogue happening, an inquiry and curiosity about the other person. It's an act of generosity for you to ask me questions about myself and my experience, right? That's a kindness that you're bestowing on me. And riffing off of Mac Hagood's insights, Jonathan Earle, a historian of Uganda and director of African Studies at Centre College in Kentucky, talks about bridging the gap between the personal and the professional. Quote, scholarly interview-based podcasts can help to make the transition from the head to the heart with questions that do deal with personal struggle and how our own and our role in that story. How does biography intersect? How does power intersect? How does source availability intersect? I think it's those types of conversations that are more inspirational. They're more generative. So the podcaster is not only an expert, but also an artisan. I think there's something about the organic quality, the genuineness, the existential quality of the conversation that makes it much more grounded and much more accessible. Sia Kibona Clark, who has spoken here at MSU, has been a guest on our podcast as well, and written an excellent book on hip hop in Africa, has been running the Hip Hop African podcast for many years out of Howard University now. Quote, all of the episodes in the Hip Hop African are themed around social issues, she told me. So it's not just, oh, you know, tell me the top artists you listen to, who are they dating, that kind of stuff. It's looking at language choice. What makes you choose one language over another, you know? What are your views on Pan-Africanism? What are your views on women in hip hop? So there are ways to have substantive discussions, and that has helped. Danger lurks in a scholarly podcast, always. And that danger is often represented by the soft interview. When I spoke with Brenda Elsie, an historian of Chile and one of the co-hosts of Burn It All Down, the feminist sports podcast I mentioned earlier, this really came out powerfully. Quote, a soft interview makes me want to hit my head against the wall. It's about a platform to feature their work. It's not about dialoguing or interrogating their work. I find that really frustrating. We need more commitment with the subject, or investment at least. It's not even just arguing, but it's caring about what we do. I guess I haven't seen that translated into podcasting in a lot of the academic ones, not yours, she pointed out, that I've listened to. And our former colleague, Rita Kiki Edozi, the political scientist now at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, who also was not just a past guest of the podcast, but also a past guest host, believes that Africa-focused podcasts are valuable resources in higher education because, quote, they bring the African voice, right? Even if it's recognizing African accents, African English accents, which vary, and you can pinpoint as you begin to listen to Africans, it also brings you the African perspective. Now, not all podcasts need to host a lot of Africans, but you do have a lot of African continental guests on your show. So it's not just the occasional scholar who has written about Africa, but you actually bring in practitioners from Africa. That's the big attraction for me. The founder and publisher of Africa as a Country, and a professor at the New School. He told me one of the Afripod episodes that I really loved was when you did an interview with Gerard Akindis. It's funny. Maybe it's also because I'm interested in sports as a humanities subject. But for me, it was more his life story. Oh, he was a basketball coach in Belgium. He had the potential to be a very good basketball player, but didn't make it, so he became a coach. And then you also get the story of that long migration of his, the patterns of migration between West Africa, in the case of Gerardo Kindes, Benin, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and France and Belgium, like that you live with uncles and relatives. The story about the basketball team, about race and gender. He coached a women's team that was very good at some point, right? All that was really fascinating for me to listen to. Just recently, I spoke with Bamba Jaya, Senegalese scholar at Emory University and the host of the Africanist between a person or several people in an audience. In doing so, it is always important to sound convincing and to also have a meaningful engagement with the audience and the person you're interviewing. I'm attentive to details about the sound quality and about the questions that I asked and them being meaningful so that it actually reflects their work, or that the stories or analysis that they're sharing are also meaningful to me. Extending on Jaya's insights, I'm going to quote Melissa Mbugwa from Nairobi, co-founder of the Africa Podfest, director of the Spotify New Africa Podcast Fund, who told me, yes, there is an art to podcasting. Fundamentally, the artist as the storyteller, as a podcaster. It's knowing your voice and owning that voice. I mean, literally your voice, but I also mean your voice like your perspective, the view that you're putting out into the world that you have and want to express. Owning that takes time, and it's an art. There's an art to relationship building because podcasting is also fundamentally about relationships. How you transmit that energy that you want to put out there and receive, there's a give and take, so your audience feels like they have this unique relationship with you. So I want to leave you with a couple of takeaways. I hope that I've started to shed some light, this is only part of a much larger project, on the ways in which scholarly podcasting that leverages the intimacy of sound broadens access to, and also importantly, demystifies Africanist specialized knowledge, while also at the same time having an impact outside of the academy. In the words of the South African media scholar Rachel Lara van der Merwe, quote, using the power, affordability, and intimacy of this medium, podcasting, to produce and distribute African stories, fiction or fact, is not only an opportunity to share our complex continent with the rest of the world, but it is also a way to build community and collaborations within Africa itself, close quote. And so Africa-related scholarly podcasts that center and amplify a diversity of African voices can help to transform literary canons and historiography, says the digital humanist Kim Gallen at Brown University, by, quote, recovering alternate constructions of humanity that have been historically excluded. I think taking sound scholarship seriously deepens our understanding of a significant innovation that's taking place in our world of Africa-focused research, teaching, and community engagement. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that presentation. And we're going to take questions starting with people in the audience. So if you have any question, and for people online, you can write your question or raise your hands and be allowed to speak.
Bernie.
Do I need to hold the microphone or they can hear me? Okay. I have one little question, maybe it's more of a technical thing, but in an age of a lot of podcasts are now migrating onto YouTube, whether it's scholarly podcasts or sports podcasts or things like this, where cameras are set up, where people are being filmed in this, where the intention is less that you put on headphones and listen to the podcast while you're out on a walk or jogging or something. How has that changed this auditory versus visual dynamic of transmitting information, that now some of these podcasts are filmed and intended to be watched, I guess?
Excellent question. And as I read the sound studies scholarship, this is a matter of hot debate. Now, I don't want to get too lost in that forest, but I have come to agree with those who take the position that podcasting is audio. It is not audio-visual. I'm not saying that people shouldn't put their podcasts on YouTube and broaden access and expand their reach, possibly even monetize if you're that inclined or fortunate, but that is a different medium. The audio-visual is a different medium, and I'll tell you why. Because I find audio-visual much more passive for the listener, the viewer, right? It's almost like if you go into a lecture hall and the lecturer is shouting at you rather than asking questions and engaging in a dialogue. When you compare it to the audio podcast, when you're listening in your ears, and this has been documented scientifically, many would argue not irrefutably so, but there is scientific evidence to point out that your brain is functioning at a much higher level when you're listening to something alone rather than watching and listening. And so my opinion is that the going visual movement of podcast is an important one. It is changing the landscape, but I think that is inherently a different medium because how you look matters a lot. It changes the way people engage with it and consume it. And again, I'm not opposed to it in any way, shape, or form. It might even be better for most people, but it's a distinctly different medium from the audio podcast, in my opinion. I see greater value, particularly for scholars, maybe because we're not really great-looking people, with not much of a fashion sense often. But no, more seriously, because we like to engage people on a sensorial level, and it's much more difficult to do that when you're using the audio-visual mode vis-a-vis the audio-first mode.
Thank you.
So you've been going for quite a long time now. Do you have a sense of who your audience is, and how they've changed, and has it grown, has it morphed in different ways?
Who is the audience for Africa Past and Present? We used to have good analytics for many years. And then we kind of lost access to whichever service it was that was providing those. We were surprised because when Peter Lim and I started this, we had no idea what we were getting into. Again, this was just a few months after the first iPhone came out. We had a little bit of experience with radio and certainly as scholars doing oral history interviewing, but podcasting as a genre was not something that we were terribly familiar with. And we were surprised that by the middle of the first year, we already had several thousand people streaming the show, and that it wasn't just in the United States or the United Kingdom, which had the strongest internet infrastructure probably in the West, and also, of course, Anglophone scholars, but we were starting to reach places like Brazil, and also South Africa and Senegal and Kenya. And by the time, we were about 7 or 8 years into the project, we had listeners in 133 different countries, including 24 African countries. And some of our successful episodes were getting several thousand streams or downloads. So I'm not sure that continued or for how long it continued, but I was surprised, pleasantly so, that it was an international audience. And I think that says a lot about the power of podcasting to amplify the work that we do, and also to do it in circles that maybe we are not reaching as scholars alone. The world outside of JSTOR, the world outside of the African Studies Association annual meeting, if you will. People who are perhaps going on a trip to the African continent and recognize their ignorance, perhaps, or simply have this insatiable curiosity to learn more, and they want to read, they want to learn from the specialists, or journalists who perhaps are becoming more sensitive to the dangers of parachute journalism, policymakers and others. So what's interesting is also how many domains we are getting listeners from that are educational domains. And so a lot of our listeners seem to be also students and lecturers. And I know I use podcasts in my classrooms regularly, and so do many others. And in fact, there's a chapter in the book devoted to the pedagogy of podcasts, both podcasts as content, but also podcasts that are student outputs. So that's also maybe an index of how the audience has changed over time from simply, listeners who are out there interested in gathering information, building communities of African studies scholars, to students who go out into their own communities also with hopefully some more informed sense of a country, a topic, a period, and so on. So.
Yes, after you mentioned about part of your audience being students, I'm wondering in this TikTok type of age where things are quick and fast, does the length of a podcast really influence the engagement of a podcast really?
Good question. How does the length of the podcast influence engagement in the era of TikTok? Well, of course, US Congress might have decided that the era of TikTok is over, but we'll leave censorship aside. Attention spans, that's always a challenge, of course. And I'd have to say that there is quite a bit of consensus among scholars, maybe not so much among people who are trying to explicitly monetize, but maybe there's a little bit in that constituency as well, that the length should be somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes. That going beyond 20 to 30 minutes, you start to lose listeners. And there's a number of reasons for this. The length of a person's gym workout, perhaps, the length of a commute, the more interesting things to do than listen to academics in a way that presents your podcast also in discernible segments. For example, Matrix did a wonderful job revamping the Africa Past and Present website over the past several years. And people kept emailing me from universities and colleges saying, we'd love to use your podcast, but we don't want to use the whole 30 minutes. Is there any way that we could use only part of it? I said, you're welcome to use it any way you want, but we haven't segmented it yet. Well, now, thanks to Matrix's work, we have segmented it. And now if you go to the website, you can click on 5 or 6 different segments on the site, and those are shorter, digestible chunks. You're only interested in the scholar's biography, click on the 5 minutes at the beginning. You're only interested in the latest book, click on the last 5 minutes or what have you. So that is in part a nod to the TikTok generation, as well as to the practicalities of a world in which there was just a deluge of information. And whether you're a lecturer or a graduate student or an undergraduate, having somebody curate that offering is really helpful. So we're immensely grateful to Matrix for making it possible for us to offer that. Steve.
Thanks. This was really helpful to me as an observer, not a practitioner. So I have a comment and then a follow-up question, which not well formed yet. But the comment is that the visual side of an audio-visual format does have one virtue that you didn't mention, and that's when you have people who speak different languages. And so that if someone is not, fluent in the language of the conversation on the podcast, but you have, captioning, and they have some choices about choosing caption in the language that they're more comfortable with, you may help them in 2 ways: help them understand and also help them improve their own language skills. So it has a pedagogical value. I understand the other points you were making just as a just a comment. And I really enjoyed the way in which you used your informants. That was very nice. Gave me a better sense of who the community is. And one that stuck out for me was the person who talked about podcasting as storytelling. Right. I think there was somebody who underlined that that way of describing what goes on in the podcast. And so my question is, when you're thinking about storytelling and you have such a wide range of sort of intellectual interest that you bring to this project, you're probably familiar with a distinction, somewhat clumsy, but still maybe somewhat useful, between didactic stories and dialogical stories. And I'm wondering how you view, and I'm not going to say podcasts in general, but your best work, putting you on the spot a bit, right? When the podcasts are working best, do they combine both sort of the conveying of information in a didactic way with moments that are more dialogical, that invite the listener to become not just a listener, but a participant in the conversation? And are there ways for them to join the conversation if it is, at those dialogical moments? There's a little technical twist there at the end.
Thank you for both the comment and the question. I agree about the comment. The visual helps in both presenting, but also consuming content in languages other than English or other colonial languages, perhaps spoken in different places around the world. Undoubtedly. So again, I'm not arguing that the audiovisual is not useful. I'm saying it's a distinct medium. And I think in language teaching, it can be very helpful with the captioning, and also in terms of, a wide range of abilities. Having the captions can be quite useful. So I think that's important. Podcasting is storytelling, both didactic and dialogical. Yeah, I think in our case, and I think it's true in some of the other podcasts that I mentioned earlier, like Ufahamu Africa, Hip Hop Africa, and China and Africa, the Africanist podcast, the ones that work the best is when those two are working hand in hand. The didactic element is always there because you're engaging with scholarship, and not all the listeners are familiar with the work of the scholars. So there is an element of listing the publications and working through maybe the intellectual trajectory of that scholar's life or a particular project. So I see that as the more didactic, but it's the going back and forth and even the improvisational, the generative moments in the conversation that really make it successful and rewarding for everyone involved. And that's difficult to do. I think what's hurt us during COVID with Africa Past and Present, and part of the reason why we paused, is that and now I'm doing it on my own, is that Zoom is great, but it does not reproduce the intimacy that a conversation face-to-face with a person produces. When people come to MSU and they give an Eye on Africa talk or a talk in a department, we get to break bread with them. We get to walk around campus, sometimes, through the rain and snow, sometimes, a lazy walk by the river in the sunshine, and we exchange all sorts of conversation and details about our lives, and we find out things about, and that kind of humanizing experience is translated into the more formal interview, and it is reflected in the kind of quality of the conversation and the direction that it goes in. And I was frustrated with not being able to replicate that via Zoom because it was too didactic. I found, I'm clearly not Terry Gross, who for many years I didn't know sits in Philadelphia and interviews people around the world in other studios. I always thought that Terry Gross was face-to-face with her interviewees, and that is not the case. I mean, she is a genius in being able to reproduce that intimacy. I'm not that good. So I think, part of the art is getting that flow going and being open to possibilities, not going into a podcast interview with a script that is almost like a survey in a field. Question A, question B, question C, tick A, tick B, tick C, and we're done. No, I mean, to me, that's a legitimate format for some, but I don't find that gratifying or satisfying. And I find it rare that interviewees enjoy that either. But in terms of engagement with the listeners also, the Ufahamu Africa is one of those podcasts that does a really good job with the website of also drawing listeners in offline, if you will, by producing show notes that are quite more detailed and more scholarly, perhaps, in bent than what we do for Africa Past and Present. And that's one way. Also, being more active on social media. Africa Past and Present doesn't have a social media presence. Other podcasts do, and that's a great way to engage with the listeners. And if I had more time and more inclination and was interested in doing that, or maybe had some support, that's certainly an avenue that I would be more inclined to pursue. So sorry, I cut you off when you were trying to follow up, Steve.
Two dialogue. But I wouldn't call it an inconsistency in what you said. But there is another way in which visuals can be helpful dialogically. In other words, and you did it a little bit in your own PowerPoint presentation, so overly clever on my part to say that. Sometimes following a conversation just in an audio way, just hearing the sound can be challenging too, keeping it all in your head, right? But if you have a picture like a Malik Sidibé photograph, that shows a boombox that you use up there, right? That can sometimes, be a way of facilitating dialogue. It's something for the listener to, get a hold of, mixing metaphors here, right? But seeing it is not a distraction from listening, but it can be a way of facilitating deeper listening. Now, I'm way out of my depth here when I say that, but that's been my experience in the classroom. If I'm having someone listen to a recording of an artist like Jacob Lawrence talk about the Great Migration series, and I don't show them a picture from the Great Migration series, they're manufacturing something in their head that may not be, the right image, mental image to go to get to enter the conversation. So that's mixing all kinds of.
See, this is what happens when you engage with a philosopher. No, thank you, Steve.
They start talking about things they don't know anything about.
And that's why we love you. That's why we need you to exit the world of strategic plans, for goodness sakes. But seriously, I get your point. It's in many ways a subjective thing. It's a question of preference. The classroom is a different space. In the classroom, we're doing different things. And we most definitely have to be creative in the ways that you suggest, alternating media and showing and telling, but also coaxing and entering into dialogue. I like to say that, I frustrate students because I provide very few answers, but I raise a heck of a lot of questions. I'm not sure students like that all the time, but there you have it. But again, I find the audio podcast is something that encourages students. It stimulates students to do the work that needs to be done. Go and visit the Archive of Malian Photography online and engage with it and look at the photographs and probe and let your imagination flow. Don't rely on the expert to tell you, right? Go and dig. Now, there are ways to guide and inspire, and I agree with you, there are a lot of ways to do it, but the audio podcast to me is something that is a distinct medium that needs to rely on that physiological and physical dynamic that I quoted at the beginning to stimulate the student or the listener to do it on their own, to kind of empower them in a sense. I know you were talking about empowerment as well, just in a different way, but I think cognizance of the distinctiveness of the medium means that it is a different thing from the audiovisual. And again, another factor to consider is audiovisual is a lot more expensive and more time consuming to produce. And if you're just going to point the camera and shoot with a little ring light, I mean, go and do it. For now, it's still a free world. Not for long, perhaps, but you can do it. But to me, you know, you're making it more challenging to be sustainable in the long term. You're consuming a lot more bandwidth, among other things, which if you're trying to reach areas that have bandwidth issues, you know, video consumes a heck of a lot more than audio alone. So those are just some other considerations. But again, I'm not intending, and I'm sorry if I gave this impression that audiovisual is not a helpful medium in what we do. Of course it is. It's just that it's distinct from audio podcasting in many important respects. There are a couple of questions online. One is, can we have access to this slide? Asks Bakene from Belgium. The answer to that is no. No, please contact me by email. My last name, Alegi, A-L-E-G-I at msu.edu. And I think Mike Green puts these on YouTube as well, so you'll be able to see the visuals later on to your heart's content. And then we have a question from Professor Benedict Carton at George Mason, who asks, how will different digital divides be critically evaluated in your forthcoming book with reference to a boldly defined global North and global South? Excellent question. Gee, we need another seminar for that. So the digital divide is part of each of the chapters, but it's discussed in most detail in the introduction. And it forms the structure in which, you know, podcasts are produced, consumed, disseminated, archived, preserved. Very, very important. And I would also point out that there are digital divides within the global North and digital divides within the global South. So as Professor Carton knows well, in KwaZulu-Natal, if you exit Durban, perhaps Pietermaritzburg, and you head, you know, into Zululand, for instance, the bandwidth changes. And so there is an urban bias, for instance, in the capacity to produce, consume, and disseminate and preserve podcasts. And I think that's really important as well. But I think the digital divide in some ways has been discussed in very political terms without attention to how things are also changing. And I mentioned Afripod Fest in Nairobi, a great network, and the Spotify New Africa Podcast Fund that Melissa Mbukwa and her colleague Jacqueline run there. I mean, there are initiatives underway to try and bridge that gap in effective ways. And part of that is letting African content producers lead the way, as they are doing increasingly. The other thing is that there is more fiber optic capacity available now on the African continent than ever before. And I think that's a positive sign, so that the gap hopefully will close. But there are ethics involved here too. And I think everyone who engages with podcasting or digital media in the African context needs to be extremely cognizant and respectful of these dynamics and put ethics first. And I think you know, making sure that there is mutual benefit and reciprocity in the process is absolutely critical. So anyone who writes about digital Africa, DH Africa, and doesn't talk about the digital divide is going to have a tough time being taken seriously. So thank you for that question, Professor Carton. Mike.
In the world of publications, articles, books, being like the official, I guess I'm thinking in whereas podcasting sit as far as publishing, you know, hundreds of stuff. And I guess how has it changed over the course of your time producing?
Is podcast publishing? How does it fit into the scholarly endeavor? Excellent question. The last narrative chapter of the project is making podcasts count, because this matters. If you put a lot of time and preparation into this, type of a medium and project, you want it to count for something, right? If a book review counts, as it does, a non-peer review item of scholarship, then why shouldn't the podcast count? It's a lot more work, in my opinion, than writing a book review, which is something you do kind of like often if the book is too expensive and so you get a free book maybe, or it's, you know, it's kind of like getting vaccinated. You do it because you have to, not because you really want to, unless you're really into needles. So podcast is a form of publishing, I would argue, and it does actually have elements of it that can be considered peer reviewed. For example, if you get an award for podcasting, that has been peer reviewed. There's usually a committee that convenes and decides, well, so-and-so has done such good work, we're going to honor him with the, you know, Geek of the Year award. That is a form of peer recognition, if not peer review. Or if you apply for a grant, to support an NEH grant, for instance, in the North American context, and you get support for a podcast or a private foundation like the Mellon Foundation, for instance, that is a form of peer review. And as a result, it's absolutely part of your scholarly publication record. When I started Africa Past and Present with Peter Lim in 2008, I kind of kept it quiet in my annual review package. I used to put it kind of in the outreach bucket. But after a couple of years, I said, no, why am I putting it in here? I'm diminishing it, actually. It's something I spend a lot of time. I think I do it reasonably well. I'm putting it as part of public scholarship. And I think that's where it belongs. And the American Historical Association, I think with its new digital history guidelines from a few years back, recognizes that these kinds of outputs should be part of the scholarly portfolio for promotion and tenure and hiring. And I couldn't agree more.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the questions and the conversation.
Thank you.